Welcome to the Woden Files, the Theories series.
It is great to be here to finally dive into this.
Yeah, and to you listening, imagine for a second walking into a church on a Sunday, praying to a Christian God, taking communion, and then you go home and proudly hang a family tree on your wall that lists the pagan god of war and magic as your great-great-grandfather.
Right, which sounds completely impossible to our modern ears.
It sounds like an absolute contradiction, right? Like the kind of historical paradox that just makes you assume someone, somewhere, made a massive clerical error. But for the kings of early England, this wasn't a paradox at all. It was actually a biological requirement.
It really is one of the most fascinating dissonances in the entire historical record. Because, we are looking at deeply pious societies. These are men who were actively funding monasteries, they were converting the heathen, and yet simultaneously, they anchored their entire right to rule on the direct descent from the chief deity of the Germanic pantheon.
Exactly. And to you listening, this is exactly why we are here today. This deep dive is the beginning of a 10-part series, with a new deep dive dropping every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yes, a massive undertaking.
Very massive. Our mission here is that we are investigating the theorists, the historians and the scholars who have argued over the centuries that Odin, or Woden in the English tradition, was not solely a god of myth.
Right, which is the standard assumption for most people.
Exactly. We are actively investigating the possibility that this figure preserved a real historical memory. Like, we are looking at Woden as a king, maybe a migrant leader, a dynastic ancestor, a sacred office, or even a deified human being.
We basically want to know what happens when you treat the mythological exterior as a later layer of paint over an older, much more grounded political structure.
Yeah, precisely.
But, we really must establish our ground rules immediately here because the historiography of this topic is just an absolute minefield.
Oh, a total minefield.
Yeah, and this series is not here to pretend that every old theory from the past few centuries was brilliant. We are going to encounter theories that were genuinely visionary, absolutely. But we are also going to see some that they identified a real historical problem, but then solved it in just the most chaotic, logically bankrupt way possible.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we know some of these past theorists saw one tiny piece of the puzzle and then just sort of ran screaming into the woods with it.
Yes, completely lost the plot.
Right. Some of the ideas we will cover in this series aren't merely outdated, they are entirely unusable today. So the purpose of this 10-part series is to sift the productive questions from the claims that belong firmly in the museum of bad ideas. We are separating the signal from the noise.
Which brings us to the core woodsman position that will guide this entire endeavor. And we have to be clear, we are not, and this is a really vital distinction, we are not trying to force every ancient source, every scrap of poetry, every runic inscription into one neat, literal biography of a single human man who lived in a specific year.
Because that's a trap, right?
It is a total methodological trap. You just can't do it. The actual question we're pursuing is whether the surviving sources preserve enough recurring historical material to make the inquiry serious in the first place.
Right. Like, are we looking at layered memories? Could this be a real elite lineage, a political founder, or maybe an older divine figure that eventually just sort of fused with political memory?
Exactly. That is the ultimate question here.
But before we can even begin judging any of those theories over the next 10 weeks, we need a foundation.
We need a master source file.
Right. So today is the prologue. We are not analyzing a specific theory today. We are actually examining the raw data that forced those theories into existence in the first place.
Setting the stage, essentially.
Yeah. Today's deep dive is built squarely on the foundational document called Nobody Was Asking Whether Woden Existed by Christopher T. Knight. And this document zeroes in on the earliest English historical and royal genealogical traditions, which, quite unapologetically, placed Woden as an ancestor of kings.
It is the absolute perfect starting point because it completely reorients the timeline for us. Before we can debate how Woden became a god or how a god became a king, we have to look at the society that first documented this duality.
Right.
And what Knight's research demonstrates so clearly is that in the Anglo-Saxon record, the historical Woden isn't some late apologetic invention. He is the foundational architecture of the whole system.
So let's jump right into section 1, which is the myth of the invented human Odin. Because the moment anyone brings up the idea of a historical Woden, there is this immediate, almost knee-jerk reaction from modern critics.
Oh, invariably.
Yeah, the standard dismissal is basically, well, Woden was always a god, full stop. And later Christian writers just got uncomfortable with their pagan past and turned him into a man to sanitize their history.
Right, as a way to just shut the inquiry down before we even open the evidence locker.
Exactly.
And it is the most pervasive reflex in modern scholarship. When critics deploy that argument, they almost exclusively point to late Scandinavian writers.
Right, guys like Snorri.
Yes, exactly. They point to Snorri Sturluson, who was writing in Iceland in the 13th century. He famously claimed in his prose Edda that Odin was actually a chieftain from Troy who migrated up to the north.
The whole Trojan origin thing, yeah.
Yeah, and they also point to Saxo Grammaticus, writing over in Denmark around the same time. And Saxo framed Odin as this cunning, disgraced human ruler, basically a wandering magician who tricked a gullible populace into worshiping him.
But hold on, if we are looking at Snorri and Saxo, we are looking at writers operating in the 1200s. That is centuries after the pagan period officially ended.
Centuries.
So to you listening, blaming Snorri for inventing the human Odin is like pointing out a massive plot hole in a modern movie adaptation and using that to claim the original novel is trash, while completely ignoring that the novel was written centuries earlier and doesn't even contain that plot hole.
That is a great analogy.
You just cannot blame 13th century Scandinavian writers for inventing the historicized Odin when the English source record is sitting right there, predating them by hundreds of years.
Precisely. And that is the fundamental chronological error that Knight's document exposes. The earliest English historians, writing way back in the 700s, the 800s, the 900s, they did not pause to introduce Woden as some strange, newly invented myth to sanitize their history.
They didn't even debate it.
No, they didn't debate whether he belonged in the historical record at all. They didn't write apologetic essays defending his inclusion. They just placed him directly inside the architectural blueprints of their kingdoms.
They treated him as a piece of geopolitical infrastructure, essentially.
Exactly.
But for a modern audience to really understand how English kings could claim descent from a figure that we today think of purely as this bearded, one-eyed pagan god, we really have to recalibrate our entire understanding of the Germanic mindset.
We do. We have to look at how they viewed the overlap between rulers, ancestors, and the divine.
Because they did not have that giant brick wall separating politics from religion that we insist on having today.
No, not at all. And to understand that mindset, we have to look at the Gothic precedent, which Knight introduces brilliantly in his work. We need to look at a 6th century writer named Jordanes, who wrote a massive history of the Goths, known as the Getica.
Right.
Now, I must offer a crucial caveat right here, just as Knight does in his research. Jordanes is not an Odin source.
Very important distinction.
Very important. Nowhere in his text does Jordanes state that Odin was a Gothic king. We must not misrepresent the text to force a connection that just isn't there.
Absolutely. No putting words in Jordanes' mouth. We aren't claiming he gives us a Woden biography, but what he does give us is a behavioral precedent.
Yes.
He shows us the actual mechanics of how early Germanic peoples processed extraordinary leadership.
He shows us the precise mechanism of deification. Jordanes describes how the Goths processed these sweeping, paradigm-shifting battlefield victories. He wrote that after such monumental successes, the Goths viewed their victorious chiefs as not mere men, but demigods.
Demigod.
Yes, and the specific Latinized Gothic word he recorded them using was ansis. And immediately after explaining this concept of the ansis, Jordanes moves directly into recounting the genealogy of the Gothic forebears.
What's fascinating here is how Jordanes completely shatters the modern binary that we carry around in our heads today, because we are profoundly conditioned by our modern categories, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
We tend to think that someone is either a literal, breathing, historical human being who pays taxes and gets sick, or they are a magical, mythical god in the clouds throwing lightning bolts.
Yeah.
We demand a choice between the two.
Right, it has to be one or the other.
But Jordanes proves this binary is completely a modern obsession.
It is entirely anachronistic. In the Germanic mind of late antiquity, a victorious leader could become a sacred ancestor upon death. And over generations, that sacred ancestor could easily blur into a semi-divine memory and eventually full cultic worship. A community could remember a single figure through political language, like as a king or a founder, and through religious language as a patron deity, without ever experiencing any cognitive dissonance.
To make this really tangible for the listener, think about the way certain modern nations revere their historical founders. Look at the cult of personality around Roman emperors, where political supremacy literally transitioned into state-sponsored divinity.
Yes, exactly.
Or even modern founding fathers. We build giant marble temples to them, we carve their massive faces into mountains, we quote their writings as if they're infallible scripture.
It's a very similar psychological process.
It is. Now take that deeply ingrained human instinct to elevate a founder and imagine it operating in a pre-literate warrior society where earthly success was viewed as literal proof of divine favor. I mean, if a king wins every single battle, he clearly possesses some kind of supernatural power.
Right, he has the favor of the unseen world.
Yeah, so when he dies, you don't just remember him, you pray to him to grant you that same power.
That is the psychological engine driving this whole phenomenon. The boundary between the elite human and the divine was incredibly porous back then. A ruler could seamlessly become a sacred ancestor, and that sacred ancestor could become a god. And this framework, this ANSYS framework, is exactly the lens we must use when we open the foundational texts of English history.
Which brings us to the heavy hitter of the 8th century, the Venerable Bede.
Oh, Bede. You can't talk about this without Bede.
If you are investigating early English history, Bede is the absolute bedrock. He is writing his ecclesiastical history of the English people right around the year 731, from the monastery at Jarrow up in Northumbria.
Right, and Bede is operating in a deeply Christian, highly intellectual environment. And when he sits down to explain the origins of the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain, he introduces the traditional leaders of that migration, Hengist and Horsa.
The famous brothers.
Yes, these were the brothers who, according to the tradition, were invited to Britain as mercenaries and eventually rebelled, found in the Kingdom of Kent. And Bede meticulously traces their genealogy. He writes that Hengist and Horsa were the sons of Vitkils, whose father was Vida, son of Victa, son of Woden. Son of Woden, just listed right there in the sequence like he's just another grandfather who happened to live a few generations back. Just dropped in there casually.
Yeah, and what strikes me is the total absence of friction in Bede's writing here.
Yeah.
He doesn't stop the narrative to apologize to his Christian readers for dropping the name of a pagan god. He doesn't offer any theological disclaimer.
No warning labels.
None. He just treats Woden as a matter of accepted, universally understood genealogical fact.
The silence is honestly the most important part of that entire passage. Bede is a fiercely orthodox monk who spends much of his book condemning pagan practices. I mean, he has no love for paganism. If Woden were merely a mythological fiction or an active demonic threat in this specific context, Bede would have excised him or explicitly condemned him. Instead, Bede uses a very specific, deeply political phrase. After naming Woden, Bede writes, "From whose stock the royal race of many provinces derive their origin."
From whose stock the royal race of many provinces derive their origin. Let's pause and really examine that for a second. Why is that specific phrasing so critical for the listener to grasp? Like, why does that change the entire Woden equation?
Because it reveals Woden's actual function and the political landscape of 8th century England. Woden is acting as a shared ancestral anchor. Think about the fundamental difference between a god and a biological ancestor.
Okay.
A god is worshipped by a population unconditionally. Anyone can pray to a god, right? But an ancestor is exclusive property. An ancestor belongs only to a specific bloodline.
Right, it's exclusionary.
Exactly. So by saying Woden is the stock from which the royal race of many provinces derives, Bede is confirming that Woden isn't just floating out there in the mythological ether. He is the hereditary justification for why these specific families hold a monopoly on violence and power.
He is literally the constitutional document that gives them the right to sit on the throne.
Yes.
And if Bede says Woden is the stock of many provinces, that means this isn't just one isolated family's pet theory. It isn't just Hengist's descendants down in Kent trying to make themselves look important. This ancestral claim formed a vast, interconnected geopolitical web across the entire island.
Which is exactly what we find when we examine our next major source, the Historia Brittonum.
Right.
This is a notoriously complex, heavily layered text compiled in the 9th century, traditionally associated with a Welsh monk named Nennius. It is basically a massive compilation of Welsh, Latin, British, Roman, and Saxon genealogical material.
Yeah.
It represents the collision of Celtic and Germanic memories in Britain.
Now, wait, this is where I need to push back a little, because I know anyone listening who knows their British history is raising an eyebrow right now. The Historia Brittonum is a British, meaning Welsh or Celtic, compilation. These are the people who were actively fighting the Anglo-Saxons. Why on earth would a British Christian compiler go out of their way to meticulously preserve the pagan genealogies of their Saxon enemies?
It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, and didn't they realize they were writing down the name of a heathen god? Were they just blindly copying a list without understanding what Woden even meant?
This raises an important question, and it is a central pillar of Knight's analysis. The compilers of the Historia Brittonum were absolutely not ignorant.
Okay.
They were highly educated scribes operating in a bilingual, heavily politicized environment. When we look at the text, the compiler actively and deliberately distinguishes between Christian, Roman historical time and the older heathen tradition of their enemies. They knew exactly who Woden was in a religious context.
So they aren't just copying a phone book here, they are carefully curating data.
Exactly. And in that curated data, Woden appears not just for Hengist and Kent. In the Historia Brittonum, Woden serves as the trunk of the family tree for the ruling lines of Bernicia, Deira, Mercia, East Anglia, and Kent.
Wow, that's almost everywhere.
Yeah. These were rival kingdoms. They were frequently at war with one another. Yet they all agreed on this one fundamental piece of political reality, that their right to rule descended from Woden.
So the British knew this.
Yes, the British compilers recorded this because it wasn't just a religious belief. It was the diplomatic reality of the island. If you wanted to understand the political structure of your Saxon enemies, you had to understand their descent from Woden.
So the compilers managed a highly sophisticated mental compartmentalization then. They rejected the pagan theology of Woden, but they fully accepted the political reality of Woden as a dynastic forebear.
That is exactly right.
They recognized that the Saxons used this lineage as their claim to sovereignty, and you just can't write a history of British geopolitics without mapping out the sovereignty of the people currently conquering the island.
Precisely. The distinction between a pagan deity to be shunned and a dynastic forebear who spawned kings was very carefully managed. Woden was undeniable historical architecture.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We can understand why a British monk might clinically record an enemy's genealogy for intelligence purposes. But what happens when we look at the most pious Christian Anglo-Saxon kings themselves?
This is where the tension really builds.
Right, because if everyone is fully aware of Woden's pagan baggage, how did they justify keeping him in the family tree of a king like Alfred the Great? I mean, Alfred is the ultimate Christian monarch. He's the defender of the faith against the pagan Vikings.
This brings us to the late 9th century, and a Welsh churchman named Asser, who wrote The Life of King Alfred.
Yes.
Asser was a highly respected scholar at Alfred's court, writing a biography designed to elevate Alfred not just as a king, but as a universally legitimate Christian sovereign. And Asser opens this text by establishing Alfred's ancestry.
Which you'd expect.
Right. He traces the West Saxon royal line backward, from Alfred's father Æthelweard, back to Cerdic, the founder of Wessex, to Gruis, to Bronn, to Beldeg, and firmly back to Woden.
But he doesn't stop at Woden. That is the part that drives modern historians crazy. Asser traces the line back to Woden, and then the genealogy just keeps going.
It just plows right through.
Yeah, he lists Woden's ancestors, moving completely out of Germanic tradition entirely, linking up with biblical history, going through Noah, and tracing Alfred's bloodline all the way back to Adam. It is this massive Frankenstein's monster of a family tree.
And this exact moment in the text is where modern skeptics love to plant their flag. They look at Asser linking Woden to Adam, and they argue, well, see, Christianity invented the whole lineage.
You're right.
They say the genealogies are entirely fictitious, constructed by monks, simply to connect King Alfred to the Bible. And therefore Woden was just a mythical name. They slotted into a fake list to make it look old.
But that argument fundamentally misunderstands how historical source material works, and Knight's document completely dismantles it. It reverses the logic of the skeptics.
Yes, it completely flips it. We have to look at what Asser actually did. Did this 9th century Christian writer reshape history by tacking on biblical ancestors? Unquestionably. That is plainly visible to anyone reading it.
Obviously, yeah.
But Asser did not invent the Woden link. He inherited a pre-existing West Saxon tradition that already had Woden firmly planted in it.
Because we've already seen it, older sources.
Exactly. We know this because, as we saw with Bede in the Historia Brittonum, Woden was already the established ancestor of English kings centuries before Asser picked up his pen. Asser's job was not to create the claim that Alfred descended from Woden. His job was to take that stubborn, immovable claim and safely absorb it into a Christian biblical universe.
Let's really think about the implications of what Asser is doing here. Think about the theological gymnastics this required. Alfred is actively fighting a desperate existential war against the great heathen army.
Literally fighting for survival.
The Vikings are actively sacrificing to Odin on English soil while this is happening. If Woden was merely a fictional fairy tale, or strictly a demonized pagan god, the easiest, safest thing for Asser to do would be to just hit delete. Just erase Woden from Alfred's ancestry and link him straight to Roman or British Christian figures instead.
But he couldn't.
Right.
That is the revelation. Woden's historical and ancestral weight was just too immense to ignore. If Asser deleted Woden, he would be deleting the very foundation of West Saxon royal legitimacy.
He'd be deleting the kingdom's right to exist.
Exactly. The political value of Woden was so high that Asser chose to perform complex intellectual surgery to neutralize Woden's paganism by making him just another descendant of Noah, rather than actually remove him from the lineage.
It is the ultimate proof of Woden's permanence in the historical memory. Up to this point, we've seen Woden acting as this silent, implied ancestor. The raiders drop his name, they build trees around him, but they don't explicitly define his earthly life. But in the 10th century, we finally find a source that says the quiet part out loud.
We do.
We find a text that explicitly lays out the mechanism of how a human ruler becomes a god.
We turn to Æthelweard and his work, the Chronicon. Æthelweard is such a fascinating figure. He is writing in the late 900s, and he is not a cloistered monk.
Right, he's different.
He is a West Saxon nobleman, a high-ranking secular official who was actually a direct descendant of King Æthelred, who was Alfred the Great's brother. He translated a version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle into this highly idiosyncratic Latin for a relative of his, Matilda, who was an abbess over in Germany.
So he is a secular aristocrat casually explaining English history to his continental cousin. And what he writes about Woden is essentially the smoking gun of this entire prologue.
It really is a breathtaking piece of historiography. When Æthelweard discusses the traditional leaders Hengist and Horsa, he, like Bede before him, identifies them as descendants of Woden. But Æthelweard goes a step further than anyone before him. He explicitly defines who Woden was in the earthly realm. Æthelweard writes that Woden was a king of the barbarians.
King of the barbarians, I just want that to echo for a second. He doesn't call him a god of the sky. He doesn't call him a magical spirit or a demon. He explicitly identifies him with a political, earthly title, a king.
A king. And then Æthelweard goes on to explain the mechanism of what happened next. He writes that later pagan peoples, struck by Woden's incredible success and power, raised him to divine status.
Wow.
They began worshiping him, seeking his aid for victory and good fortune in battle.
To explain this clearly to you listening, Æthelweard is employing a concept known as euhemerism. That is the theory that mythology is derived from real historical events and real historical people who were later exaggerated and deified by oral tradition.
Yes, named after the Greek mythographer Euhemerus.
Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical theory for Æthelweard. He is applying it directly to his own ancestors. He's saying Woden was a real barbarian king, he won immense victories, he founded our dynasties, and generations later, the pagan populace turned their admiration into literal religious worship.
And what makes this so profoundly significant is the timeline and the tone. Because later on in the 12th and 13th centuries, we see other writers use this exact same euhemeristic mechanism, but they use it maliciously.
Right, like Saxo.
Exactly. Saxo Grammaticus, writing in Denmark, uses this exact mechanism to humiliate Odin. Saxo writes what is essentially a hostile prosecution brief, claiming Odin was this pathetic human trickster who used cheap magic to fool stupid peasants into worshipping him. Saxo's goal is to degrade and embarrass the pagan past.
Right. Saxo is basically writing Christian propaganda to say, look how dumb your ancestors were, worshiping this absolute con artist.
Precisely.
And centuries later, you get the Victorian historian Thomas Carlyle, who takes the same idea but makes it super romantic. Carlyle argued in the 1800s that Odin was a charismatic human teacher and captain, a great man of history, whose people were so moved by his leadership that their admiration just naturally bloomed into worship over time. Carlyle gave us a beautiful emotional mechanism, but it was just a theory.
But Æthelweard gives us the proof that this concept existed as a native English historical tradition long before Saxo's hostile polemics or Carlyle's romantic theories.
He proves it wasn't just a Victorian TED Talk.
Exactly. Æthelweard is writing in the 900s. He isn't writing a polemic. He is calmly, rationally explaining his own family tree to his cousin. He understands the dual-layered identity perfectly. Woden the historical king and Woden the later object of pagan cult worship. He separates the historical man from the theological God without dismissing either one as pure fiction.
It fundamentally changes how we view the Scandinavian sources, doesn't it? We are always told Snorri Sturluson invented the idea of a human Odin in Iceland in the 1200s, but Snorri may have just added the fantastical Trojan origin story. The core formula that Woden was a ruler first and a god later was already sitting right there in the English historical record, written by a West Saxon nobleman 300 years earlier.
Bede gave us Woden as a genealogical anchor. The Historia Brittonum showed us Woden as the father of multiple rival royal lines. Asser proved that Woden was so vital he had to be preserved and grafted onto biblical history. But Æthelweard gives us the explicit historical formula.
Right.
Woden was remembered as a king in the ancestral past, and the god worshipped by later pagans. The two layers existed simultaneously in the medieval mind.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might logically assume that this nuanced historical memory was just some fragile quirk of the early Anglo-Saxon period. You might think, surely this memory was destined to be wiped out by the massive cultural trauma that was coming. Because in 1066, the Norman conquest happens.
It changes everything.
The entire political and cultural map of England is violently rewritten.
It was an absolute apocalypse for the old English aristocracy. The French-speaking Normans cross the Channel, William the Conqueror takes the throne, and the Anglo-Saxon elite are slaughtered, exiled, or totally disinherited. The entire power structure is replaced overnight.
So you would naturally assume that Woden, a Germanic pagan ancestor of the defeated kings, would be immediately thrown in the trash by the new Norman rulers. But he wasn't. The tradition was incredibly, stubbornly durable.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the 12th century, the absolute height of the Norman era, and a historian named William of Malmesbury.
Okay, William of Malmesbury.
William is a monk writing in the early 1100s. He is operating in this post-conquest world, trying to bridge the gap between the Anglo-Saxon past and the Norman present. And when William writes his history of the English kings, he openly relies on this long-established Woden tradition. He draws directly on Bede, on the chronicles, on writers like Æthelweard.
He doesn't discover Woden independently in some dusty, forgotten tomb. He inherits Woden as part of the official state apparatus.
Exactly. Even after centuries of total Christian cultural dominance, even after dramatic political upheavals and a total regime change, Woden survives. And he didn't just survive in tavern songs or in peasant folklore whispered in the deep woods away from the eyes of the church. He survived as a fundamental gear in the machinery of English historiography. The Norman-era historians recognized that if you wanted to legitimize your rule over England, if you wanted to understand the historical architecture of the island you just conquered, you had to interact with Woden.
So, what does this all mean? We have marched through an unbroken chain of historical documentation here. We looked at Jordanes providing the behavioral framework of deified leaders in the 6th century.
The ancestors.
Right. We looked at Bede cementing the lineage in the 8th century. We explored the Historia Brittonum mapping out the rival dynasties in the 9th. We saw Asser fusing Woden to the Bible for King Alfred.
The great theological compromise.
Exactly. Then we read Æthelweard explicitly calling him a barbarian king in the 10th. And finally, we saw William of Malmesbury preserving it all after the apocalypse of the Norman conquest in the 12th century.
What this means, and what Christopher T. Knight's research demands we acknowledge, is that the surviving sources do not give us a neat, modern, localized biography of a single man named Woden.
It's just not there.
No, that was never their purpose, and searching for one is a fool's errand. What they do preserve, however, is a remarkably stable, enduring, centuries-long historical memory of a dual identity.
A dual identity. Woden belongs to pagan religion, absolutely, yes. He was worshipped, sacrifices were made to him, he was feared as a god of war. But simultaneously, at the exact same time, Woden belongs to royal ancestry. He belongs to rulership, to the memory of the migration period, to the geopolitical foundation of England itself.
The historical record carries both of these concepts simultaneously, and that is the foundation for our entire 10-part series. This dual identity is the massive, complex problem that modern historians often skip over because it is messy.
It doesn't fit into neat little boxes.
Exactly. They want him to be just a god, because if he is just a mythological god, they can easily dismiss the genealogies as mere fiction. They can ignore the problem entirely. But long before any medieval writer debated whether Odin came from Troy or Scythia, the English historical record had already declared its own native formula: Woden, king of the barbarians.
The foundation is set. You have the blueprints now. In the coming weeks, we will look at exactly how theorists have tried to solve this mystery. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something that wasn't explicitly spelled out in Knight's document, but something this entire journey builds toward.
It's the logical next step.
Right. We have spent an hour talking extensively about how the kings and the highly educated chroniclers used this dual-layered Woden to legitimize their rule. They used him as the ultimate political anchor to claim the throne. But what does this say about the psychology of the common people they ruled over?
That is the real mystery, isn't it?
When an everyday Anglo-Saxon farmer or a spearman standing in a shield wall looked at their king, what did they actually see? Did they see a literal, magical descendant of the divine, infused with supernatural power? Or did they simply see the lucky hereditary heir to a very successful, ancient barbarian general who won a lot of battles?
It changes the entire dynamic of authority.
It does. If the line between man and God was that thin, that porous for the ruling class, how did it shape the way everyday people viewed earthly power? Did believing your king's ancestor was a god make you more compliant to the laws? Or did it implant the dangerous idea that anyone with enough swords, enough charisma, and enough victories could eventually become a god themselves?
It is a profound question. It touches on the very mechanics of human belief, the origins of political power, and the stories we tell ourselves to justify who gets to rule.
And it is exactly the kind of question we will be circling as we move forward into the theories. The investigation continues at woodensman.com. Follow at Woodensman for the next file and watch for the forthcoming book, coming out December 1st, 2027, The Quest for the Historical Odin.